I'm Chef Richard Miller. Welcome to Chef Richard's Kitchen. On this episode today, we're going to do some oyster appetizers. Lots of people are required to bring appetizers periodically, and oyster and shrimp are very good ones just simply because most people like seafood. So we're going to do a couple of them today. The first we're going to do is going to be Oysters Rockefeller. And an interesting story behind Oysters Rockefeller. It was originally created in the late 19th century down in New Orleans at a restaurant called Antoine's that was owned by a fellow by the name of Antoine Alciatori. His son Jules Alciatori was the head chef at the time. And it was always rumored, but nothing is really proven, that Oysters Rockefeller, well, first of all, was never named Oysters Rockefeller. It came later. But it was substituted when they ran out of escargot or snails. And oysters were plentiful in New Orleans, and they just went ahead and they started using that. The other part of the tale is we all use spinach in Oysters Rockefeller, and we still do. The thing is that it was never thought that spinach was actually part of the recipe originally. The original recipe called for a green herb blend, and most people thought it was parsley and watercress and chives and some various other green herbs in there, but never spinach. And Antoine and Jules Alciatori were so tight-lipped with the recipe that they never ever let it on what was really in there. And it was also said that whenever someone asked Jules, he always threw out spinach as a red herring for it. Well, no one ever really knew what was in it, and it seems like everybody liked the spinach, and so it just kind of took on a life of its own. So we're going to go ahead and use spinach today. That's what they're all made out of. By the way the name came about was at one time one of the customers came in and was served their oyster dish, and he says, "Why, this dish is as rich as old Rockefeller." And there's where the name came from, supposedly. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk about these today. And the first thing I want to do is we're going to have to shuck some oysters. And I wanted to talk a little bit about oysters because when you shuck them, there's always two sides of the shell, obviously. But if you look at one, you'll find that the one side is deep, where the other side is flat. We don't use the flat side, we use the deep side on our dishes. We put our oysters in there with whatever topping we're going to put on there, and we bake or broil them as it is. Now, what happens to these? Well, they never get thrown away. What they do is they go to a reclamation center, and these are ground up for calcium. And most of the calcium supplements that you find are actually, oyster or other seafood shells. So, first off, when you buy your oysters, they're living beings, and we want to treat them as such because we want to make sure that when we cook them, they're still good. I learned something the other day when the person at the counter was selling these, and what he did was he tapped on them. And I said, "What's the tapping? Is that to see if they're good?" He says, "Yes." He says, "If they tap and they have a full sound," he says, "they're fine." He says, "If it has a hollow sound, that means they're dead and they're outgassing, and it gives it a nice hollow." So that is fine. We'll go ahead and use it. Now, to shuck an oyster, first off, I recommend a nice glove. And these gloves, they're usually level 5 cut resistant, and that's what you want to make sure you're using. and then a special shucking knife that you use. You put the knife in down by the hinge part, you pull it open, and then you scrape the shucking knife along the top. Now you see the oyster in here. The oyster has a muscle that connects to each side of the shell. And so when you shuck this, you go ahead and slide that in and cut that muscle there. You can also either use this the way it is, or what I tend to do is I'll go ahead and I'll cut it out. And the reason is, when you're serving something, think of your guest first. You don't want your guest to have to be going in and digging this out, especially if they're going to be eating it out of the shell or even with one of those little small oyster forks or shrimp forks. You don't want them doing that. Though what you want them to do is just enjoy the meal, so I always go ahead and cut them out of the shell. All right. Number 2. And here's our third. And there we go. Now we have 3 sides of the shell that we're going to go ahead and discard, and then the other 3 sides, well 4 because I did one earlier, the 4th that we're actually going to use to fill. So let me take a minute now, and I want to take and dry these, and because I want to dry them simply because when we put them back in the shell and we go ahead and put them in the oven to bake them, we don't want it sliding back out. And the liqueur, the oyster liqueur, is slick. So let's just go ahead and do yourselves a favor and just go ahead and take and run them between a paper towel. Don't press them too hard, or what you're gonna find is you're simply gonna find out that it got turned to pulp. The other thing I like to do is some of these can get pretty good sized. I like to take and cut them in half. And the reason is because once again, you're thinking about your guests, and your guests don't really want to be trying to fight an oyster, trying to cut it in half in the shell while they're standing somewhere. Do that for them. All right, here's our paper towel. Put our oysters on there. Just pat them dry. And I just use a pair of scissors. There. All right. Now, let's start making the filling. All right. When we start our filling, we're gonna have 2 parts of it. We're gonna have the breadcrumb part, and we're gonna have the buttered part, or the sautéed garlic butter. So what we want to do is, the first thing to do is take a couple of tablespoons of unsalted butter. Put them in your saute pan, and a teaspoon, probably a clove of garlic in here. Now let's go to the stove, we're at the stove, we're going to go ahead and wait for the butter to melt and for the garlic flavor to infuse into that. Then we're going to go ahead and put the rest of our ingredients for the butter in here. Then we're going to start off with our breadcrumbs. In fact, we can do that while we're doing this. For our breadcrumbs, we'll take a 1/4 cup of panko breadcrumbs and we'll put them in there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to wait. We're going to wait until we have our butter mixture. We're going to put half of it into this, and for that, then we're going to use that as the basis for the rest of our crumb mixture. Okay, our butter's melted and the garlic's infused. Now we're going to take and add some shallots. That's about 2 shallots chopped up and a tablespoon or so of fresh parsley. In this case, I was using Italian flat leaf parsley. All right, stir that around a little bit. Now we put 2 cups of chopped up spinach leaves. All right. Now, you want to take Pernod. It's a liqueur, it's an anise flavor, kind of a licorice flavor. Take a 1/4 cup of that. And add that to our spinach mixture. And then let's cook it down just a little bit. And we're going to stir these until the spinach wilts down. It doesn't take long. Spinach wilts down quickly. All right. Now, let's take about half of this and the liquid and put it in with our breadcrumbs and mix them together. We're going to put in a little pinch of pepper, bit of salt, not much, and just a little bit of hot sauce. And that's just Louisiana style cayenne pepper hot sauce. I made some of it here. In another episode, we're going to talk about how to go ahead and make that. It's actually pretty easy. Okay. All right, now we're going to take probably about 1/4 cup of Parmesan cheese. And I go ahead and I get the block of it and I just go ahead and grate it myself. And the big reason for that is I've always heard that grated cheese is coated with some coating so that it doesn't stick together, which also causes it not to melt and turn golden as easily. So, as I'm not a food chemist, I can't confirm or deny, but I just always figure, why take a chance? Okay, go ahead and mix this all in. Okay, now, I've prepared the shells, and you prepare them by putting them, in this case I'm using a pie plate, a glass pie plate, and some rock salt. And the reason you put the rock salt down there is that way the shell doesn't rock all over. So let's go ahead, I want to turn this up, I want to start the oven to about 450. And while we do that, let's go ahead and let's assemble our oysters. So we take and we put a piece or two of our oyster down in each shell. And now we're going to take and put a spoonful of our topping. Okay, there's our oysters ready to go in the oven. So let's go ahead and let the oven heat up. It'll probably be another 10 minutes or so. We'll come back and we'll go ahead and cook them then. Don't go away. The oven's heated up now, so let's go ahead and let's put the oysters in there, and we're going to bake them for about 10 minutes until they turn golden on top. Set the timer for 10 minutes, and we'll be back as soon as it's baked. Let's take them out of the oven and see how they look. You see that the breadcrumbs have browned. If you want, you can take, this is just a little pecorino romano, and put just a little bit of that on them just to decorate a little bit and give it a little more unique flavor. All right. You can also take, and if you serve this as appetizers, you know, you're going to want to dress it up just a little bit, add a little garnishment around it. You can add all sorts of things in here. I'm using some more of this flat leaf parsley, some dill, some kale, etc. And there you are. There's Oyster Rockefeller. That's a dish you'll be happy to serve and you'll be proud of to serve. It's really, really good. Oh, by the way, one other thing. What happened to the rest of that in the jar or the bowl that I had that I didn't use on that? Oh, don't throw it out. Believe me, you're going to end up having to make some more for people. So make sure you keep it. For this next recipe, this is going to be Oysters Kilpatrick. The name Oysters Kilpatrick actually comes from the hotel manager, John C. Kilpatrick, or Colonel Kilpatrick, that managed the San Francisco Park Hotel, or Place Hotel, I'm sorry, from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. The head chef of the Palm Orchids restaurant in the hotel, Ernest Armgo, named its dish for the hotel's manager. Be nice, wouldn't it? Must have been trying to keep his job. I didn't say that though, did I? Anyway, to make Oysters Kilpatrick, let's just start out, and we're going to start with some bacon bits. And this is just probably about, a third, half cup, something like that. And then we're going to add 8 ounces of crab meat. Now, one thing about the crab meat that I would like to remind you, remember when you're cooking these, who's the first and foremost in your mind? Your guests, right? Well, pick the crab over to make sure there aren't any shells or anything else in there that are going to be nasty. The last thing you want is to have your guests over and have them bite into a shell or something like that. So pick your crab over and get any shells that you can find out of there. About a 1/4 cup of chopped parsley. Probably about a 1/4 cup of Worcestershire sauce. A 1/3 cup of ketchup. A 6-ounce can of tomato paste. probably about a teaspoon of lemon juice. That tends to brighten it just a little bit. And here we add probably, a third of a cup or something like that of the Pecorino Romano cheese. Let's go ahead and stir these in well. Here's a challenge to all my viewers out there. Try making these. Try making the Oysters Rockefeller, the Oysters Kilpatrick, and we're going to make a boozy oysters after this. And see which one you like best. Feel free to write me and tell me which one you like the best. I'd be more than happy to hear from you. Okay, now that we have our mixture, let's go ahead and put these in a pie plate. Now remember, for this demonstration, I'm only making 6 and I'm using a pie plate with some rock salt in it. When you make it for more than this, you'll need to use a bigger plate, such as a baking sheet or whatever. In this case, I'd use the bigger rock salt in there, just because it's extremely inexpensive, and you can use a whole lot of it in a baking sheet and you're fine. Alright, so let's just take and put our oysters, just like we did for the Oysters Rockefeller. These are oysters we took, shucked out of the shell, and dried off. And now let's go ahead and let's put our Kilpatrick sauce on top of this. Okay, now in this case, the last one we baked at 450. In this case here, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to set the broiler. And we're going to broil these for probably about 4 to 5 minutes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take them out part way, and we're going to put a piece of shrimp. And this shrimp I've already pre-cooked. And when I say pre-cooked, I didn't cook it all the way. Oh, it's perfectly safe to eat the way it is. It's cooked through enough. But I'm going to put it on just this way because when we put it back under the broiler again for a couple of minutes, we don't want the shrimp to turn out like shoe leather. So give this a couple of minutes the heat up, and we'll be right back. I'm going to set it for 3 minutes, and then we're going to take a look at it. Okay, I added a couple of minutes onto that, so they've been in there 5 minutes now, and they're ready to come out. So let's take them out from under the broiler, let's bring them out, let's put the shrimp on them. And I'm going to put just a little bit more Pecorino Romano on the top of these. Not much, just enough to kind of give it a little finish. All right, now let's put it back in for a couple more minutes under the broiler. Now we'll take these out when the cheese is melted and turned to golden brown, and the shrimp has gotten kind of a little golden around the edges on there. Okay, we're ready now. Let's go ahead and take these out of the oven. And here we have it, Oysters Kilpatrick. This is another one where you'd go ahead and you serve it at parties, appetizers, or even you could serve it as a first dish, before a meal. Either way, it works great. It's delicious. It tastes is fantastic. And what about all the rest of that I made? Same with the Oysters Rockefeller. Keep it, because you're going to be asked to make some more. Okay, for our last dish, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make another oyster dish, and we're going to make oysters with white wine. And this starts out with a stick of butter at room temperature that we're going to go ahead and we're going to stir in about a couple tablespoons of white wine. This is Riesling that I'm using, but basically any white wine would be fine. A clove of garlic. A little Romano cheese. A couple of tablespoons of chopped parsley. About 6 ounces of crab meat. Now remember, as I told you in the dish before, when we were making Oysters Kilpatrick, remember and think about your guests, and remember to pick over your crab meat to make sure that there aren't a bunch of shells in there. And finally, what we want to do is we want to stiffen this up just a little bit So we're going to put some more panko breadcrumbs in here. Now I'm not going to put all of them in there. I'm probably going to put in, this is probably about 1/4 cup. Now let's go ahead and blend these in. I think I'm going to add just a little bit more. Okay, now that we have our topping mixed up, let's go ahead and let's prepare our oysters. And before we do that, I want to set the broiler to preheat. Now, let's go ahead, and these are the oysters I prepared earlier. They're just simply the oysters we shucked out, and I've cut them in pieces. And remember what I've said before, the first thing you think about are your guests. And do you want your guests trying to cut oysters and whatever while they're trying to hold them, as an appetizer? No. So go ahead and cut them in, probably quarters or halves, depending upon the size of the oyster in the first place. All right. Now once again, remember, you'd be making these, if you were making these, you'd be making them more than 6. But I'm just making them as 6, but my topping is probably more for a couple of dozen. So go ahead and use the topping, but when you do, plan on a whole lot more oysters than this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this topping. Of course, I'm going to make some more for me afterwards. So, all right, go ahead and put the topping on. All right, now we're going to sprinkle just a few more of the breadcrumbs on top. When these go in the broiler, these will become nice and golden. All right. Now let's give it just a couple of minutes and we'll put them in the broiler. All right, let's go ahead and let's put these in the broiler and let's let them sit for, probably 3 to 5 minutes, something like that, and we'll check them afterwards. We'll set that for 3 minutes and we'll check them afterwards. Okay, the timer's gone off. Let's take them out of the oven and see what they look like. That's exactly what they're supposed to look like. Notice that the breadcrumbs have browned. Everything else is looking nice and golden in here. Those are just absolutely perfect. So if you want, we can go ahead. We could sprinkle a little parsley in there if we wanted. These are basically, if you're going to garnish the tray that you're putting them in, and remember, if you're going to be making these, you're going to be making them more than just one tray. These are some pea tips that are off the pea plant. Put a couple of those in there. That was hot. And maybe a couple of dill sprigs. And maybe a little parsley. If you want, we can put a little endive in the center of that. And here you go. Here's an oysters with white wine that you'll be proud to serve to anyone, and anyone will be glad to have these. So now we've learned 3 different oyster appetizers. Feel free to go ahead, once again, step outside your comfort zone and just go ahead and try them. If it doesn't work out, what's the worst that can happen? You pitch them and start again. That's how we all learn. In the meantime, take care, God bless, and remember the first thing I always tell you about cooking. Cooking's supposed to be fun. Thanks for watching. See you next episode.